Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the January 2020 Living Environment Regents exam. We're going to be starting with number 1 and ending at number 30. Starting with 1, where it asks us there are over 2,000 kinds of edible insects in the world and they are becoming an increasingly popular source of protein. 1 cup of cricket flour contains over 28 grams of protein. The building blocks of protein in cricket flour are amino acids. You should already know this. Amino acids, right, are the building blocks of all proteins, right? And the amino acids are made by the mRNA and tRNA, which is made by the DNA, right? So amino acids equal building blocks of protein. A protein is just a long chain of amino acids. Moving on to number 2, it asks which list contains only abiotic conditions that might be found in a pond ecosystem. Remember that abiotic is non-living, not alive condition. So an abiotic factor could be oxygen, it could be pH, it could be temperature. Right? So let's see which choice matches this. Is it choice number 1, temperature of the water? That's abiotic. Green plant populations, that's not abiotic, that's biotic, right? Because plants are alive, right? So moving on to choice number 2, temperature of the water, that's abiotic, right? Dissolved oxygen in the water, oxygen is not living, that's abiotic. And dissolved minerals, that's also abiotic, right? Those are all non-living things, and they're all conditions. And all the other choices, bacteria, that's living, and fish populations, that's also living. Number 3 says that protein synthesis is accomplished primarily by the interaction of which two cell structures? We just went over this when we said that amino acids are made by mRNA, right? But this one is different. It's saying which two cell structures, right? Well, whenever you think of a protein, whenever you think of protein synthesis, I want you to think of one thing, and that's ribosomes. Right, because the proteins are actually synthesized in the ribosomes, right? So we can automatically eliminate number 1 and 4 because the mitochondria has nothing to do with proteins, right? So now we're left with ribosome and vacuoles versus nuclei and ribosome. The answer to this is 3, nuclei and ribosome, because although the protein is synthesized in the ribosome, right, the with RNA, right? The RNA is actually synthesized in the nucleus, right? So a quick overview is inside the nucleus is where we have transcription, which is a DNA strand that gets copied into an identical DNA strand, right? And then outside the inner nucleus, right, but still inside the nuclei, what we have is translation happening where DNA is then translated into mRNA, right? And then this mRNA is then transported out of the body, or out of the nucleus into the ribosome, right, where it binds with the tRNA, and then rRNA, ribosomal RNA, to synthesize one codon, where it makes the codon, right? Which then gets turned into the amino acid, right? And that's a pretty complicated process. You don't need to know all the inner workings of it, but all you need to know is that the protein is actually synthesized in the ribosome, and the instructions for how to synthesize that protein is then made in the nuclei, right? So moving on to number 4, identical twins were separated at birth and raised by 2 different families. Years later, one twin was a physically fit member of the cross-country team, and the other twin was overweight with slightly higher than normal blood pressure. The differences in these 2 twins can be explained by the fact that what? Right? So let's just look at these choices, right? Number 1, the genes in the 2 individuals are completely different. That's wrong, right? Because they're saying that they're identical twins, right? Identical twins, if they're identical, that means their genes must also be identical. Right? Number 2, in twins, each individual inherits genes from only one parent. No, they inherit genes from both parents. Both twins inherit the genes from their mother and their father. Right? That doesn't make sense here. Number 3 says that DNA bases in the twins combine differently. That's also not true, right? Because if they're identical twins, that the DNA bases were combined in the same way because they're identical, right? But also DNA bases always combine the same. A twins with T, adenine binds with thymine, and cytosine binds with guanine. That will always be a constant, right? That leaves us with 4. The environment can influence the expression of genes, right? Since they were separated at birth, right, and raised by 2 different families, one family and the lifestyle that they gave that one child obviously influenced the expression of the blood pressure gene, right? It made it go higher, and then the other child who was in the other family who was put to probably a lot of physical activity, that excess physical activity probably activated or deactivated a gene for blood pressure as well, right? So the environment does influence the expression of genes, and that's shown here, right? Just by just the sheer difference of how each twin developed. Moving on to number 5, it says that the diagram below represents various factors in an area. I was gonna say that it's a food web, but it really isn't. It is just various factors in an area, right? So what does a diagram best represent, right? So number 1, does it represent the recycling of energy in the forest community? No, right? Because where do I see any energy here, right? I see. Well, I guess you could make a case that this does show energy, but does it really show the best form of energy? It says photosynthesis and then respiration, excretion, dead animals. Really, the only thing here that really shows energy is photosynthesis, right? And that's pretty much it, right? So it's not really the best choice. Number 2 says ecological succession after climate change. That's wrong, right? Because what ecological succession is when you have like a large natural disaster, or that completely devastates an environment, or you have just like a barren plot of land, and out of that plot of land starts to grow bushes and grasses, shrubs, and then eventually trees and animals move in. That's ecological succession. This shows none of that. This doesn't show like life developing in an otherwise lifeless environment, right? 3 says competition for limited resources in a population. This does not show that at all, right? Because at no specific point does it single out 2 specific species and point to them eating or competing over one resource that they both share, right? It just says animals, dead animals, bacteria. There's no competition between these categories. Number 4 says the flow of materials in the forest community. I think that this is the best explanation to how what this really describes, right? Photosynthesis, all this means is that the plants are then transferring oxygen and glucose, oxygen and glucose to the animals. The animals, through respiration, are then transferring CO2 and water back to the plants. The animals' excretion, that would be ammonium to the bacteria, and then with the dead animals to the bacteria, that would most likely be some form of nutrient, and then from the bacteria to the plants would probably be nitrogen or ammonium, right? Which they got from the excretion of the animals. So what I'm trying to get at here is this is more a diagram of how materials flow in a forest community rather than the recycling of energy, really, right? If each one of these diagrams had the energy level of the plants, of the animals, of the dead animals, then you could make a case that it was a recycling of energy. But since it doesn't show that, that's not the right answer. Number 6 says that traits are passed from parent to offspring. These traits are determined by what, right? Are they determined by chromosomes located on genes found in the nucleus? That's wrong, right? Because chromosomes aren't located on genes. Genes are located in chromosome or on chromosomes, right? Number 2 is the answer that gets that right. Genes, which are located on chromosome, which are found in the nucleus, right? Let me just draw a diagram. Here you have your little chromosome, little X-shaped pattern, right? This is your nucleus, and that's your bigger cell. And inside of this chromosome, which lies in the nucleus, right, you can find all of this DNA, which is tightly woven. And inside of this DNA, in I guess this small section, you could find a gene, right? So remember it goes DNA, gene, DNA, DNA, chromosome, nucleus, right? Sorry, that wasn't the eraser. Oops. Okay. Moving on to number 7. It asks, in which cell structure is energy extracted from nutrients? Obviously, that's the mitochondrion, aka the guess what? Powerhouse of the cell. All that happens here is cellular respiration, which means that we take glucose and we take water. And we take oxygen, and then we turn it into CO2, ATP, and H2O, right? So This is where energy is extracted from nutrients. The nutrients are usually in the form of a sugar, right? Moving on to number 8, the diagram below represents a food web in a pond ecosystem. This is a food web. Two carnivores in the food web are, right? So if you don't know how a food web works, wherever the arrow points to, that indicates who's eating who, right? So if an arrow is pointing to, for example, the crabs, the arrow from the crabs is pointing to the bass. That means that the bass eat the crabs, right? So the way I like to remember it is it goes from the mouth of the mouth of one to the mouth of other, right? So the crab, it goes from the mouth of the crab to the mouth of the bass, right? So, well, all I want to say is that the bass eat crabs, right? And the bass eat crawfish or crayfish, right? So obviously bass is going to be one of them, right? So we can automatically eliminate 2, 3, 4, right? Because they don't show bass. Or actually, never mind. It doesn't always have to be bass, but here. So that's one carnivore, right? Here's another carnivore, crabs, because crabs, the arrow points from small invertebrates to crabs. So the invertebrates go into the mouth of the crab, right? So that's carnivore number 2. The crabs go into the mouth of the bass. That's carnivore number 1. The crawfish go into the mouth of the bass, right? And then the small invertebrates go into the mouth of the crawfish. That's carnivore number 3, right? So crabs and crayfish or crawfish are the 2 carnivores, right? Carnivores are animals that eat other animals. Number 9 says daughter plants consist of tangled yellow masses of yellow leafless vines and contain few chloroplasts. The vine twists around and grow into the stems of other plants and absorb water and nutrients from them. Which statement describes this relationship, right? So obviously this is describing a parasitic relationship. Remember that a parasitic relationship is one where the host is hurt while the parasite benefits. Right here, what's happening is that the parasite is benefiting because it's sucking up the nutrients of the host plant, and the host plant is being hurt because it's simply because the parasite is simply just taking away all of its food, all of its water that it's intaking from the roots, right? That's the best way to describe this relationship. Sure, daughter plants, I wouldn't really describe them as consumers, right? I wouldn't really classify them as producers. They could be really either, depending on what you look at it, but they 100% are parasitic, and that's undeniable, right? And once again, they're not decomposers. Number 10 says 2 kittens in a litter are genetically different from each other and their parents. These genetic differences are most likely due to, number 1, sexual reproduction. Remember, asexual reproduction means that the offspring are genetically identical to the parent, right? If you want to clone something, that means that, cloning is artificial, but it also means that the clone is going to be identical, right? And evolution is something completely different. If they evolved, it would be a different species, right? It wouldn't be a kitten. It would be something else, right? Sexual reproduction is the only process by which 2 parents can produce a offspring that has a mix of the genes of both both parents, right? That's the only way that you can really get variation. Moving on to number 11, it says that a genetic change that occurs in the body cell of a mouse will not contribute to the evolution of the species because what? Because the body cell mutation will cause the cell to die before it reproduces. Not always. Not all mutations immediately lead to cell death. Some stay with the cell forever, right? Think about cancer. That's a mutation, and that cell keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. So think about that, right? That's not always true. Number 2 says the evolution of a species can result from changes in reproductive cells, not body cells. This is the correct answer, right? Because if this is already in a body cell, right? And you have this mutation, how is this ever going to get passed on to your offspring? Because it's not. Because the genetic material, right, the chromosomes inside your body cells are always going to stay with you. Any changes made to your body cells are going to stay with your body cells, right? Because your body synthesizes a separate type of cell for sexual reproduction, right? We use a different type of cell, right, with specifically packaged chromosomes to reproduce, right? So if it was a mutation in a reproductive cell, that cell will actually have the chance to combine with another cell and possibly move on, pass on the mutation. But the body cell always stays in the body, and since it always stays in the body, it can't be fertilized. It can't fertilize anything else, and that means since it can't contribute to fertilization, it cannot pass on that trait. Number 12 says, scientists who have examined fossil records have noticed that some species have changed very little over long periods of geological time. The lack of change in such organisms is most likely because what? Well, number one, all members of their population were genetically identical and they lived in a rapidly changing environment. That would be false, right? Because if some species have changed very little over long periods of time, right, that means that their gene is stable, right? The more identical you are, that means the less stable your species are. And if you're living in a rapidly changing environment, it is highly, 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 highly unlikely that you will stay genetically identical. You'll most likely develop adaptations to the changing environment and have actual change. Number 2 says there is a large amount of variation in their population and the environment changed frequently. All that large amount of variation, right? That just means that there's a great and high chance of the species developing specific adaptations to their changing environment, right? So number 2 supports the theory that there was great change in the species over a long period of time, right? Because the variation allows for more mutation to occur within the species, which would make the species change as a whole, right? And also a frequently changing environment also invites natural selection to the argument, which causes further change, right? Number 3 says they could move between environments when food supplies became scarce. This is also not. This is also wrong, mainly because the fact that if you're moving between two environments, you're most likely also going to evolve to better survive in one of the environments, and it also leads to the possibility of just the species splitting into two separate populations who live in two separate environments, feeding on that specific food instead of just migrating between the two. That leads to 4 as the right answer. The environment that they lived in remained the same, and they were well adapted to it. That's it, right? The more, if you're well adapted to an environment, right, there's no need to evolve, right? Natural selection has nothing to select for since you're already well adjusted to your environment, and because your environment isn't changing, once again, there's no need for any new adaptations. Number 13 says doctors often use medications to treat infections. A few people have reaction to some of these medications, such as itching, swelling, or trouble breathing. This is an example of what? Well, this is an example of a body's immune system overreacting to a usually harmless substance, right? Whenever you see few people have a reaction to a medication or have a reaction to something, and you have common symptoms of allergies, right? AKA itching, swelling, or trouble breathing. Those are allergy symptoms, right? It's usually your body's immune system overreacting, right? All that 2 is describing is an allergy, right? And all this is describing is that some people have allergies to medications, right? The body's creating a mutation. The body never creates a mutation willingly. A vaccine causing the body to produce antigens against infection. Vaccine will not cause you to have itching, swelling, or trouble breathing, right? And using antibodies to cure a medical problem doesn't make sense, right? Number 14 says that organisms that live on land rarely compete for what? Well, it seems like they rarely compete for oxygen, right? Because oxygen is readily available to all of us. You know, in New York City, you have over 8 million people living there, and you don't see anyone ever fighting for oxygen, but you always see them fighting for space, food, and water. You know, you can really apply this anywhere on land. You know, think about like the billions and billions of ants who live in all over the you know, Amazon rainforest. Like no matter how big they are, no matter how big the environment, oxygen will always be abundant to land creatures at least. Number 15 says orcas are endangered whales. Only 80 individuals remain off the coast of Washington State. Salmon are a source of food for orcas. Some individuals are proposing that 4 dams in Washington State be removed so that the habitat areas for salmon will be increased. Those opposed to the dam removal say that dams provide low-cost hydroelectric power and positively influence the economy. And here's a cool photo of an orca. Right, this situation is an example of a decision where benefits and risks have to be weighed. Right, literally all that the blurb had said right there was that some people think it'll benefit us, some people think it'll harm the environment. Right, so this is based on what the individuals in this scenario said. It's safe to say that this is a highly debated or highly contended decision that needs the benefits and risks to be weighed, right? Number 16 says a small lizard spends the morning hours lying in the sunlight until its body temperature rises. Later on in the day, the lizard rests in a shady area until its body temperature cools. This type of behavior is important to, number 1, maintain homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is the balance of your bodily needs, right? It's also called dynamic equilibrium. Just making sure that everything is maintained, right? So in the case of a lizard, at least, one big part of homeostasis in all animals actually is maintaining your internal body temperature, right? So by spending the morning hours lying in the sunlight, he raises his internal body temperature until it's at a certain point where it's at its until it's at a high point, and then he goes into a shady area to cool it down, right? So and it's this cycle of raising your body temperature, lowering your body temperature, and that's his attempt to maintain a constant body temperature, right? So number 17 says sexually reproducing organisms pass on genetic informations as what? Well, 17, the answer to this is 4, obviously. Bases of A, T, C, and G. This is what makes up your DNA, right? Which is your genetic material that you pass on, right? Complex sugars, that's not what makes DNA. Inorganic compounds, that's not what makes DNA. There are organic compounds in DNA. And long chains of amino acids, you may be tempted to put this, but this is proteins. We don't pass on genetic information as proteins. We pass it on as DNA, which are blueprints to proteins. Some viruses attack cells by attaching to their outer covering, entering and taking over their genetic machinery. Viruses are able to invade cells after first attaching to their what? Well, think about what we just said. Some viruses attack cells by attaching to their outer covering, right? Outer covering. What do you think that would mean? Well, that obviously means your cell membrane, right? Right? Think about it. If this is a diagram of a cell, the cell membrane will be the outer covering, and you have to break through that, right? You may be tempted to say nuclear membrane, right? But nuclear membrane is inside of the cell membrane, right? You first need to break through the outer covering, which is the cell membrane, in order to gain access to the genetic machinery, which is found in the nuclear membrane. Number 19 says gene mutations can be caused by many things. These mutations are biologically important because they do what? Well, it's because they can result in a new variety of gene combinations in a species, right? Biologically important. Why are mutations biologically important? Well, think about how species evolve, right? Think about how we develop certain adaptations. It's always through mutations. It's a random mutation that happens, and it just happens by whatever chance to be beneficial, right? Mutations always result in variation in species, which is variation and variety in both genes and in both species are very, very important aspects of biology, right? Once again, mutations aren't always harmful. Sometimes they're helpful. It could be an advantageous trait that starts as a mutation, right? Number 2 is wrong. We said this in a previous question. They cannot be passed to the offspring if they occur in any cell of the body. It has to be a sex cell, like an egg or a sperm. And they cannot occur, and they usually don't occur at a regular rate. They're usually they're pretty rare, and most are random. Right? So number 20 says, maintaining a rich variety of genetic material that may lead to discoveries useful to humans can be ensured by preserving biodiversity, right? Think about it. A rich variety of genetic material, isn't that the same thing as saying a diverse or diversity or a diverse gene pool, right? And by preserving biodiversity, right? Biodiversity measures the how diverse a community is, right? And if you want a rich a variety of genetic material, you need a diverse community. So if you preserve biodiversity, you ensure that there's more diverse creatures, communities, and genetic material, right? Asexual reproduction, we do the opposite, right? Because this produces identical offspring that would not be diverse at all. Selective breeding also doesn't make anything diverse at all, because you're specifically breeding them for a purpose, and cloning also makes identical copies, which is not biodiverse, right? 21 says many bacteria and fungi are important in the environment because they do what? Well, fungi and bacteria are decomposers, right? And the main purpose of decomposers are to recycle nutrients and make them available for other organisms, right? So let's just say this is a dead animal, right? Decomposing bacteria would probably start eating at it, right? And then as they start eating at it, they obviously the carcass goes away, but they end up recycling the nutrients from the carcass, right, through their excrements into the soil, where plants then reabsorb it and then use it to grow, and then use it to when they grow, this once dead animal carcass would have eaten their growth, right? So always remember that decomposers recycle nutrients. They do not return energy. They recycle nutrients, right? Why don't they return energy? Because energy is always some 10% of energy is always lost to the environment, right? So 22 says, which statement best describes the characteristic of a carrying capacity of an ecosystem, right? It is limited by the habitat's available energy and nutrients, right? That's pretty much what the carrying capacity is, right? It's a specific number or specific amount of species or organisms or individuals that can live in a specific environment before it reaches like this imaginary line where everything starts dying after they reach the line, because they don't have enough nutrients, right? And they don't have enough energy. That's all, right? Food webs can't illustrate it. And it does the opposite. It limits their size, so 2 can't be right, and it's not directly determined by an organism's reproductive success. It's mainly determined by the environment they live in. 23 says the Venus flytrap is a plant that has a unique system by which it traps and breaks down prey. Unsuspecting insects land on the leaf and touch tiny hairs located on the leaf, triggering the leaf to close around the prey. The substance responsible for the breaking down of the Venus flytraps most likely contains enzyme molecules, right? Whenever you think or whenever you hear something, the word breaking down, always think of enzymes. Enzymes are molecules that are commonly involved with the breaking of chemical bonds, with the digestion of different molecules. So remember that, right? Think of DNA helicase, right? Helicase is the thing that unwinds the DNA, the DNA for translation for transcription, right? That is done by breaking some bonds in the DNA molecule, right? So whenever you think of breaking down, think enzymes. Number 24 says it may be harmful when people compete to see who can hold their breath the longest underwater without oxygen. Sorry. It may be harmful when people compete to see who can hold their breath the longest underwater without oxygen. Brain cells. Well, think about it. What cellular process needs oxygen? Cellular respiration, of course. The first thing that cellular respiration needs is O2 plus glucose to make ATP, right? And if we eliminate the O2, right, or reduce the O2 intake of the cellular respiration reaction, guess what? We can no longer produce ATP. Answer is number 1, right? And of course, since the brain cells can't produce ATP, they begin to die, which is never a good thing. Number 25 says students did an experiment comparing the activity of 4 different enzymes, A, B, C, and D, and the results are represented in the graph below, right? So relative rate of enzyme activity is the y-axis, and then the pH is that. Right, so before we go on to the question, it is very important to note that enzymes can often catalyze and speed up reactions in addition to break down molecules. And it's also really important to note that certain enzymes are most effect. Enzymes are usually limited by both by temperature and by pH level, right? Certain enzymes and almost all enzymes have a specific pH level that they like to work best at, but that they work best at, and they have a specific temperature that they also work best at, right? So a valid conclusion based on the information in the graph is that what? Well, a difference in pH level of the environment changes enzyme activity. Isn't that what I just said? And isn't that what this says, right? Look here, right? These are all in the same the reactivity of all of these are measured. We're all measured in the pH scale of 1 to 14, right? So if we look here, A works best in an acidic environment, but if we look at where B starts, B works horribly in an acidic environment. It works best in a neutral environment, right? If we look at D, D works exclusively in a base environment, right? Because if we look here, anything past like 8, the rate of enzyme activity is 0, right? We know that C works in slightly basic conditions, because if we look here, there's nothing in acidic, right? So all this shows us is that enzymes A, B, C, D all have their preferences and all have specific pH levels where they work the best at, right? And all other choices kind of really don't make sense, right? The pH of some enzymes changes as the temperature changes. That's wrong. Enzymes change color. That's wrong. Enzymes activity causes acids to change to bases. They don't, right? I don't know how to pronounce that. It's pretty late, guys. Eugelina are unique single-celled organisms. Depending on physical conditions present in their aquatic environment, they can act as either producers or consumers. Cool, right? This organism will most likely act as consumers when placed in an environment that has what? Well, obviously the answer is going to be 3, little or no light present. Why? Because we just said that they can either be producers or consumers. Producers are usually plants, they're autotrophic, and almost all producers, or virtually all producers, undergo photosynthesis, right? Which is sunlight plus CO2 plus H2O, right, into glucose, which then they use, which is their food, right? So the main thing that limits the rate of photosynthesis, of course, is sunlight, right? And if there's little to no light present, they cannot undergo photosynthesis. But the cell still needs to eat. It still needs energy. It still needs food, right? So when there's little or no light present and you cannot undergo photosynthesis, they turn into a consumer, right? They begin consuming other organisms for that energy that they can't find in photosynthesis, right? Acidic pH pretty much won't change anything other than killing it. A low oxygen level, if anything, a low oxygen level and a high amount of sunlight would prompt it to change from a consumer to a producer, right? And many predators really doesn't have a change in anything, right? It's little to no light present. Number 27, the diagram below illustrates the movement of glucose across a cell membrane. Cool. So each one of these circles is a glucose molecule, and they enter through this channel, right? And notice that we're going from low to high, right? Instead of high to low. So this is an active transport, right? We're going against the gradient. In reality, if we took away this barrier, the glucose would want to go into the low glucose concentration, because think to osmosis and diffusion, it always goes from high to low, right? So what does it ask us? Which two processes are most directly represented in this diagram, right? So what were we just talking about? We were talking about molecule transport and energy use, right? So because this goes against the gradient, because this is going from low to high, this requires energy, an input of energy at least, right? And how we do it is through this protein, all this protein does is it transports the glucose from the low concentration to the high concentration. So here we have molecule transport, and because it uses energy, as I literally said 2 seconds ago, energy use is also here, right? ATP synthesis is not here because it's just glucose moving across it. Homeostasis and ATP synthesis, I don't know where they got ATP synthesis from, that's wrong. Homeostasis and the diffusion of water, that's also wrong, because if it was diffusing, it would go from high to low. Moving on to number 28. The diagram below shows the relationship between the snowshoe hare and the lynx. The snowshoe hare is a prey of the lynx, right? The populations of the two species increase and decrease based on the numbers of each species present. This relationship is an example of what? Well, if anything, it should be interdependency, right? Because think about it, right? These two are linked. Whenever there's a high snowshoe hare population, guess what happens, right? The lynx population increases. Whenever there's a massive snowshoe hare population, there's a boom in lynx populations, right? All these peaks and all these dips follow each other, right? So whenever one goes up, the other goes down. Whenever one goes up, the other one could also go up, right? So they're interdependent on each other. If there's more snowshoe hares, there would be more lynx. If there's less snowshoe hares, there'd be less lynx, right? And that's interdependency. They're not competing because that's predator and prey. Predator and prey don't compete. An energy pyramid, this doesn't show any energy at all. And ecological succession, once again, you know, as I said, where are the new plants coming from, you know? 29. The following fertilization, a zygote divides and soon becomes a multi-celled embryo with many different cell types as represented below, right? So zygote, embryo, muscle cell, intestinal cell, liver, cardiac nerve, blood cell. Which statement best explains this development, right? So this process is called specialization, and that's represented by choice number 1. Specialization occurs, resulting in the formation of a great variety of cell types. That's what specialization and differentiation is, right? One cell turning into many, with each with their unique purpose, right? So number 30 says the diagram below represents change that takes place within the human body. So we go stability, stimulus, instability, and internal conditions, response, stability. This represents, of course, dynamic equilibrium, right? Because we're going from a point of stability to a point of stability. What we're trying to do is we're trying to remain balanced, keep everything balanced, keep everything stable in response to a stimulus, right? So for example, if it's really hot in my room, I'm gonna start sweating. I'm gonna start sweating in order to try and cool myself down, right? So the stimulus would be heat, instability, internal condition. My body temperature is rising rapidly, and my response is to sweat, right? And that sweat makes my body temperature lower, and that makes me more stable, right? So dynamic equilibrium equals homeostasis equals balance, all the same thing, right? So that's all 30 questions from this section. To those who are taking the test tomorrow, I wish you the best of luck. You all got this. If you like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe if you want more content. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. That being said, have a nice day.